400 aircraft. That's how many Axis planes the Special Air Service destroyed on the ground across the deserts of North Africa between late 1941 and early 1943. 400 aircraft eliminated not by squadrons of bombers flying at 20,000 feet, not by coordinated artillery barrages, not by armored divisions grinding across the sand in broad daylight. They were destroyed by teams of 4 and 5 men moving through the darkness on foot, placing handmade bombs on fuselages, or roaring through airfields in open-top jeeps with machine guns blazing at point-blank range. The Royal Air Force's Desert Air Force, with all its Hurricanes, Spitfires, and Kitty Hawks, with all its pilots, mechanics, fuel depots, and airfields, shot down fewer enemy aircraft in the same period than a unit that never exceeded 400 men. A brigadier at Middle East headquarters in Cairo read the after-action tallies in late 1942 and said 6 words that none of his staff could argue with. How is that even possible? The answer to that question is the answer to everything that came after. Every hostage rescue, every covert assassination, every impossible raid conducted by the SAS across the next 8 decades traces directly back to what a small band of unconventional soldiers learned in the furnace of the North African desert between 1941 and 1943. It was not a story of natural-born warriors descending fully formed onto the battlefield. It was a story of catastrophic failure, radical adaptation, and the discovery of principles so powerful that they would eventually make the regiment unbeatable. And it began with a man on crutches breaking into the most heavily guarded military headquarters in the Middle East. In the summer of 1941, the British Empire was fighting for its survival. The Wehrmacht had conquered France, driven the British Expeditionary Force into the sea at Dunkirk, and was now pushing deep into the Soviet Union. In North Africa, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps had arrived in February, and within weeks had reversed every British territorial gain in Libya. The British were being pushed back toward the Egyptian border. If Egypt fell, the Suez Canal fell. If the Suez Canal fell, Britain's connection to India, to its oil supplies in the Persian Gulf, to the entire eastern architecture of its empire, would be severed. The stakes were existential, and the conventional British forces in North Africa were struggling. The Eighth Army, a sprawling multinational formation drawing troops from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India, was fighting Rommel in a grinding war of maneuver along the narrow coastal strip between the Mediterranean and the impassable sand seas of the deep Sahara. Thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, and enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, and water were consumed in battles that swung back and forth across the same stretches of Libyan desert with exhausting regularity. Tobruk was besieged. Benghazi changed hands repeatedly. The front line was fluid, unpredictable, and voracious. Into this crisis walked Lieutenant David Stirling of the Scots Guards. He was 25 years old, 6 feet 5 inches tall, the son of a brigadier general and a product of the Scottish aristocracy. He had been educated at Ampleforth and Cambridge, though he had left Cambridge after a year, preferring the mountains to the lecture hall. Before the war, his ambition had been to climb Everest. He had volunteered for the Commandos in 1940, joining No. 8 Commando under Lieutenant Colonel Robert Laycock, a formation that sailed for the Middle East in early 1941 and was eventually disbanded after suffering heavy casualties in Crete and along the Litani River in Lebanon. Stirling was left adrift, a restless officer without a unit, nursing injuries from a parachute training accident that had left him temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. He spent weeks in a military hospital in Cairo, and in that hospital bed, bored and frustrated, he began to think. The thinking was not abstract, it was ruthlessly practical. Stirling had observed the commando raids in which he had participated and found them fundamentally flawed. The operations had been large, loud, and logistically cumbersome. They required naval transport, elaborate planning cycles, and hundreds of men. They achieved minimal strategic effect relative to the resources they consumed, and they telegraphed their intentions to the enemy long before the first man hit the beach. Stirling believed there was a better way. His idea was deceptively simple. Instead of sending 200 men to attack a single target with the full knowledge of the enemy, send 5 men to attack 5 targets with none. Small teams, inserted deep behind enemy lines by parachute or vehicle, could strike airfields, supply dumps, and communication centers simultaneously across hundreds of miles of front. The desert, which conventional military thinking treated as an obstacle, was actually an asset. Its vastness provided cover. Its emptiness meant that small groups moving at night could operate undetected for days or weeks. The enemy's attention was fixed on the coastal front line. No one was watching the desert behind them. Stirling knew that taking this idea through normal channels would ensure its death by committee. So he did something that would become the defining act of his legend. Despite being on crutches, he talked and bluffed his way past the sentries at Middle East headquarters in Cairo, gained access to the building, and managed to reach the office of Major General Neil Ritchie, the Deputy Chief of Staff to General Claude Auchinleck, the Commander-in-Chief. Stirling presented his memorandum. Ritchie read it, grasped the concept immediately, and took it to Auchinleck. The Commander-in-Chief approved the formation of a new unit on the spot. It would be called L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. The name was a deliberate fiction. There was no SAS Brigade. The designation was borrowed from a deception operation already underway, designed to convince Rommel that a full airborne brigade was stationed in Egypt. In reality, L Detachment consisted of 6 officers and 60 enlisted men. Stirling recruited his founding cadre from the remnants of lay force and the disbanded commando units scattered across the Middle East. He chose men not by their rank or their regiment, but by their character, their fitness, and their willingness to endure. 2 of his earliest and most important recruits would shape the SAS as profoundly as Stirling himself. The first was Lieutenant Jock Lewis of the Welsh Guards, an Oxford rowing blue and former president of the Oxford University Boat Club. Lewis was meticulous, disciplined, and intellectually rigorous, the opposite of Stirling in temperament, but his equal in determination. He became the unit's training officer and set standards of physical and tactical preparation that the regiment maintains in recognizable form to this day. The second was Lieutenant Robert Blair Mayne, universally known as Paddy. Mayne was an Irishman from Newtownards in County Down, a pre-war solicitor, an amateur boxing champion, and an international rugby player who had toured South Africa with the British and Irish Lions in 1938. He was also volatile, heavy drinking, and physically formidable. When Stirling found him, Mayne was reportedly under arrest for striking a senior officer. Stirling recruited him anyway. It would prove to be one of the most consequential personnel decisions in British military history. The training camp was established at Cabrit, a desolate stretch of sand near the Great Bitter Lake, approximately 100 miles south of Cairo. There was almost nothing there. 3 tents, minimal equipment, and the limitless desert in every direction. Jock Lewis designed the training program, and it was savage. Physical conditioning was relentless. The men ran, marched, and cross-trained in heat that routinely exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. Parachute training was conducted without proper apparatus. In the absence of training towers, Lewis had the men practice jumps by leaping from the back of moving trucks at 30 miles per hour. It was improvised and dangerous. 2 men, Ken Warburton and Joe Duffy, were killed during the first parachute practice when their chutes failed to open. The deaths shook the unit. Lewis organized a funeral, identified the cause as entangled lines, corrected the procedure, and ordered everyone to jump the next morning. Stirling went first. No one refused. Beyond physical conditioning, the training focused on skills that would define the SAS for generations. desert navigation by sun compass and stars, demolitions, the use of every weapon available, British, Italian, and German, so that operators could arm themselves from enemy stockpiles if necessary. Signals and communication, first aid sufficient to treat gunshot wounds and fractures without a medic. And above all, self-reliance. Every man was trained to operate alone, to navigate alone, to survive alone if separated from his patrol in the emptiest landscape on Earth. Lewis's most consequential contribution was not a tactic, but an invention. Existing British explosive devices were either incendiary or blast-producing, but not both. Destroying an aircraft on the ground required a device that could both rupture the fuel tank and ignite the contents. No such bomb existed in the British inventory. Working with a mixture of Nobel 808 plastic explosive, diesel oil, and thermite, Lewis created a compact device weighing about a pound that combined blast and fire in a single charge. It could be carried in a haversack, placed on an aircraft wing or fuselage by one man in seconds, and detonated on a time delay. The Lewis bomb became the SAS's signature weapon across the entire desert campaign. It was elegant, lethal, and simple, exactly the kind of tool a four-man team needed when it had to destroy 20 aircraft in the dark and disappear before dawn. The first operation came on the night of November 16, 1941, timed to coincide with General Auchinleck's Operation Crusader Offensive. The plan was ambitious. 55 men would parachute from 5 Bristol Bombay transport aircraft onto 5 Axis airfields near Gazala and Tamimi in eastern Libya. They would destroy the aircraft on the ground using Lewis bombs, then march 50 miles inland to a rendezvous with the long-range desert group, who would extract them back to friendly lines. It was an unmitigated disaster. A violent storm struck the drop zone that night, producing winds exceeding 30 knots, driving rain, and near-zero visibility. The conditions were clearly unsuitable for a parachute operation. The men knew it, the pilots knew it, but Stirling understood that if he canceled the mission, Middle East headquarters would likely disband L Detachment before it ever proved itself. He ordered the jump. The consequences were catastrophic. The paratroopers were scattered across miles of desert. Equipment containers were lost. Men landed in the wrong locations, miles from their objectives. Some were injured on landing. Some wandered the desert for days. Not a single airfield was attacked. Of the 55 men who jumped, only 22 made it back to British lines, most of them rescued by the LRDG. More than 30 were killed, wounded, or captured. L Detachment had lost over half its strength in a single night without inflicting a scratch on the enemy. Any conventional military organization would have dissolved the unit at that point. The concept appeared to have failed, but Stirling possessed a quality that would prove more valuable than any piece of equipment or any tactical plan. He could learn from failure faster than most men could learn from success, and the LRDG had just shown him how. The Long-Range Desert Group had been operating behind Axis lines since 1940, founded by Major Ralph Bagnold, a Royal Engineers officer and legendary pre-war desert explorer. The LRDG was a reconnaissance and raiding unit that specialized in deep penetration vehicle patrols across the Sahara, navigating by sun compass and the stars, covering thousands of miles through terrain that the Axis considered impassable. Their trucks were modified Chevrolet 30-hundredweight vehicles stripped of every unnecessary component, carrying extra fuel, water, and ammunition. They could operate for weeks without resupply, traveling 2,000 miles on a single patrol. When they rescued Stirling's survivors after Operation Squatter, one of the LRDG patrol commanders made a suggestion that changed the war. "Why are you parachuting in?" he asked. "We can drive you." Stirling seized the idea. The parachute concept was abandoned. From that moment forward, the SAS would be delivered to its targets by vehicle, driven across the desert by the LRDG's expert navigators, dropped off within marching distance of the objective, and retrieved after the raid. The partnership between the two units became one of the most effective special operations collaborations in military history. David Stirling himself would later say that the LRDG was the finest of all units serving in the desert. The SAS provided the raiding capability. The LRDG provided the navigation, the transport, and the lifeline back to friendly territory. The second operation, launched on December 14, 1941, validated everything. 3 raiding parties struck simultaneously at the airfields of Tamat, Sirte, and Agudabia. Stirling led the party targeting Sirte. Jock Lewis took Agudabia. Paddy Mayne took Tamat. The results were staggering. Stirling's group was frustrated by the unexpected presence of a German armored division moving along the road to the front, which forced him to abort. Lewis reached Agudabia and found the airfield empty of aircraft, though his team destroyed vehicles and communications infrastructure. But Mayne at Tamat delivered a performance that became instant legend. Leading a small team onto the airfield under cover of darkness, Mayne first attacked the officers' mess, catching German and Italian aircrew off guard. His team then moved methodically through the lines of parked aircraft, placing Lewis bombs on fuselage after fuselage. When the supply of bombs ran out, Mayne began physically tearing the instrument panels from aircraft cockpits with his bare hands, ripping out control columns and smashing gauges. In a single night, 24 aircraft were destroyed, along with fuel dumps, an ammunition depot, and a line of telegraph poles. The SAS suffered no casualties. The LRDG extracted them cleanly across hundreds of miles of desert. In one night, with a team of fewer than a dozen men, Mayne had destroyed more enemy aircraft than most fighter squadrons managed in months. 2 weeks later, he returned to Tamat and destroyed 27 more. The Germans never expected the same target to be hit twice in such rapid succession. That assumption that the enemy's expectations could be exploited as ruthlessly as his defenses became a founding principle of SAS doctrine. Throughout early 1942, the raids escalated. Stirling and Mayne refined the methodology with each operation. They attacked airfields at Benina, Birka, Bagouche, and across the coastal strip of Libya. They struck at night, moved fast, and vanished before the enemy could respond. The LRDG delivered them to within miles of their targets and waited at prearranged rendezvous points for the pickup. Each raid taught lessons. Each failure was analyzed and corrected. When Lewis bombs were found to have a reliability problem due to primers becoming damp during long desert marches, the SAS adapted by finding ways to reduce transit time. This adaptation eventually led to their most radical tactical evolution, the armed jeep column. In the summer of 1942, the SAS acquired its first Willys jeeps. These lightweight American vehicles were immediately modified for desert raiding. Twin Vickers K machine guns, originally designed as aircraft weapons, were mounted front and rear. The Vickers K was a drum-fed weapon with a devastating rate of fire, nearly 1,000 rounds per minute. A single jeep carried 2 pairs, giving it the close-range firepower of a small infantry section. The jeeps were fast, agile, and could navigate terrain that would stop heavier vehicles. They transformed the SAS from foot-mobile saboteurs into a mechanized strike force capable of covering vast distances and attacking with overwhelming violence at close range. The tactical change was profound. Instead of sneaking onto airfields on foot and placing bombs quietly on aircraft one at a time, the SAS now drove directly onto the airstrips in columns of jeeps, machine guns blazing, and destroyed everything in their path. The shift from stealth to shock was not a retreat from the original principle. It was an evolution. The desert had taught them that the enemy's response time was the critical variable. If you could destroy the target and be gone before a coherent defense was mounted, it did not matter whether you arrived silently or at speed. What mattered was surprise, and surprise could be achieved through audacity as effectively as through concealment. The supreme demonstration of this doctrine came on the night of July the 26th, 1942, when Stirling led 18 armed jeeps against the Sidi Hanesh airfield, a major Luftwaffe complex approximately 235 miles west of Cairo. The column drove 50 miles through open desert from a hidden camp at Bir el Kusir, navigating by the stars without headlights. As they approached the airfield, the runway lights suddenly switched on. For a moment, the raiders feared they had been detected. They had not. The lights were for a Luftwaffe bomber coming into land. Stirling fired a green flare. The jeep surged forward in a V formation onto the airfield, Vickers guns hammering into the rows of parked aircraft. Junkers 52 transports, Junkers 87 Stukas, Messerschmitt 109 fighters, all were raked with incendiary and armor-piercing rounds at distances measured in meters. The Germans responded with machine guns and anti-aircraft weapons, disabling one jeep and killing one SAS man. But the column tore through the airfield in minutes, destroying 37 aircraft, before roaring back into the desert darkness. They evaded enemy patrols and aircraft for the rest of the night and reached their advance camp on the edge of the Qattara Depression by dawn. 1 man killed, 37 aircraft destroyed. The escape from Sidi Hanesh was itself a masterclass in desert survival. With only 2.5 hours of darkness remaining, the jeep column split into groups of 3 to 5 vehicles to reduce their profile against air attack. At dawn, they were exposed and vulnerable. They hid under camouflage nets in the scorching sand, engines cooling, men drinking sparingly from water cans that were already running low. One group of French SAS paratroopers, slowed by punctured tires and mechanical breakdowns, was spotted by 4 Stuka dive bombers that made 9 separate strafing runs. Paratrooper André Zernheld was fatally wounded. The survivors piled into their last functioning jeep and drove for the rendezvous, reaching safety with fuel tanks nearly dry. The desert gave nothing freely. Every victory was purchased with risk, and the currency of that risk was measured in water, fuel, distance, and the tolerance of the human body for heat that could exceed 50 degrees Celsius in the open. The conditions under which the SAS operated in the deep desert were almost beyond comprehension. Bearded, sunburnt, wearing Arab headscarves and whatever clothing they could scavenge, Stirling's men subsisted on rations of hard army biscuits, tinned corned beef, dates, and chocolate. Water was rationed to a few pints per day, barely enough to prevent dehydration, nowhere near enough to wash or shave. When their water cans ran dry, they resorted to brackish, insect-infested water from desert wells. Vehicles broke down constantly. Sand infiltrated everything. Fuel had to be calculated to the gallon because running out of petrol in the deep Sahara meant death. The men drove for hundreds of miles with deflated tires to prevent bogging in soft sand, a technique borrowed from the LRDG and navigated by sun compass during the day and by the stars at night because magnetic compasses were unreliable in iron-rich desert terrain. This was not war as the generals in Cairo understood it. This was survival grafted onto combat, and the men who thrived in it became something different from ordinary soldiers. In a single year, Paddy Mayne alone had personally accounted for the destruction of over 100 enemy aircraft on the ground, a tally that exceeded the score of any Allied fighter ace in the entire war. After one raid at Fuka Airfield, Mayne reported that the enemy had posted sentries on nearly every aircraft. He had to knife them before placing the bombs. That detail, delivered without drama in an after-action report, captures the reality of what these operations demanded. This was killing at arm's length in the dark and then walking calmly to the next aircraft and doing it again. The Germans had nicknamed Stirling the Phantom Major. Rommel himself was reported to be furious at the losses, and the Africa Corps eventually formed a dedicated anti-SAS unit tasked specifically with hunting them down. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who took command of the 8th Army in August 1942, offered a characteristically dry assessment of Stirling. "The boy Stirling is quite mad. Quite mad. However, in a war, there is often a place for mad people." By September 1942, the results had become impossible to ignore. L Detachment was officially redesignated the 1st Special Air Service Regiment, a recognition that elevated it from an improvised experiment into a permanent formation of the British Army. What had begun with 6 officers and 60 men in 3 tents at Cabrit was now a regiment with multiple squadrons including French and Greek elements, its own transport, and a reputation that preceded it on both sides of the front line. But the desert taught the SAS far more than how to destroy aircraft. It taught them principles that no formal military academy could have imparted, because the principles could only be learned through sustained exposure to an environment that punished every excess and rewarded every economy. The first principle was self-sufficiency. In the desert, there was no rear echelon. There were no supply depots within reach, no reinforcements on call, no medical evacuation chain. When a 4-man patrol left friendly lines and drove 500 miles into the Sahara, those 4 men carried everything they would need to survive, fight, and return: water, fuel, food, ammunition, medical supplies, navigation equipment, communication gear, spare parts. If a vehicle broke down, they fixed it themselves or abandoned it and walked. If a man was wounded, his teammates treated him with whatever they carried. If they ran out of water, they died. This brutal simplicity produced operators who were, by necessity, competent in every skill required to sustain themselves in hostile territory. They could fix engines, dress wounds, navigate by the stars, cook on open fires without creating visible light, camouflage vehicles in featureless terrain, and ration water down to survival quantities. When these same skills were later demanded in the jungles of Malaya, the mountains of Oman, the streets of Belfast, and the alleyways of Baghdad, the SAS already possessed them. The desert had made them standard. The second principle was economy of force. The SAS learned in North Africa that a small number of highly skilled operators, properly directed, could achieve strategic effects completely disproportionate to their size. 400 men destroyed 400 aircraft and countless vehicles, supply dumps, and infrastructure targets. They tied down Axis security forces across thousands of miles of rear area. They forced the Germans to divert resources from the front line to guard installations that had previously required no protection. The principle was not theoretical. It was proven in operational data that could be counted in burning wreckage, and it became the foundational doctrine of the regiment. Every SAS operation from that point forward, from Malaya to the Falklands to Iraq, was built on the premise that a small, superbly trained team could accomplish what battalions could not. The third principle was adaptability. The Desert War forced the SAS to reinvent itself repeatedly in a span of fewer than 18 months. They began as parachutists. Parachute insertion failed, so they became foot-mobile saboteurs delivered by vehicle. The Lewis bomb worked, so they became demolitions experts. Lewis bombs sometimes failed, so they became machine gunners driving armed jeeps directly onto airfields. The enemy adapted, posting sentries on aircraft and increasing perimeter security. So the SAS adapted again, attacking multiple airfields simultaneously to spread the defensive response, striking the same target twice in quick succession to exploit the enemy's assumption that lightning wouldn't strike the same place again, varying their approach routes to prevent pattern detection. Every adaptation was driven not by doctrine written in a manual, but by direct operational experience, analyzed by the men who had conducted the missions. This feedback loop, operation, analysis, adaptation, operation, became the engine that powered the regiment's evolution. It runs to this day. The fourth principle was the primacy of intelligence. The partnership with the LRDG had demonstrated that reconnaissance and intelligence were not merely enablers of operations, but were operations in their own right. The LRDG's road watch patrols, which monitored the Via Balbia, the main Axis supply road between Tripoli and Benghazi, by hiding within observation distance and counting every vehicle that passed, provided the Eighth Army with detailed knowledge of Rommel's supply and reinforcement situation. The SAS absorbed this lesson completely. In every subsequent campaign, intelligence gathering, through human observation, agent networks, signals interception, or all three combined, would precede kinetic action. The four-man observation post, lying concealed for days watching a target, recording patterns of movement, mapping defenses, identifying vulnerabilities, became an SAS staple. The desert taught them that seeing without being seen was worth more than shooting. The fifth and perhaps most fundamental principle was that the quality of the individual operator determined everything. The desert was the ultimate filter. Men who could not navigate were useless. Men who could not endure extreme heat, cold, thirst, exhaustion, and isolation were liabilities. Men who could not think independently, make decisions under pressure, and act without orders were dangerous to themselves and everyone around them. The desert did not care about rank, background, regiment, or reputation. It cared only about competence. And this understanding shaped the SAS selection process permanently. When the regiment was reconstituted after the war and David Stirling's original principles were codified into the selection course conducted across the Brecon Beacons in Wales, the philosophy was a direct translation of what the desert had demanded. Find the individuals who can function alone, under extreme physical and psychological stress, with minimal equipment, across terrain that would break ordinary men. Then give those individuals the skills to operate anywhere on Earth. The Desert Campaign ended for the SAS with a paradox. On January 10, 1943, David Stirling was captured in Tunisia by a specialized German unit that had been formed specifically to hunt him. He attempted to escape, joined a group of local Arabs, and was betrayed by them back to the Germans for 11 pounds of tea. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, eventually ending up at Colditz Castle. His capture was a blow, but it did not destroy the regiment. That was perhaps the final proof of everything the desert had taught. The SAS was not a personality cult built around one man's charisma. It was a system, a set of principles embedded in an organizational culture and transmitted through selection and training. Paddy Mayne assumed command and led the regiment through the campaigns in Sicily, Italy, France, the Low Countries, and into Germany itself. The second SAS was raised under Stirling's brother William. The SAS brigade that fought in Northwest Europe in 1944 and 1945 was a multinational formation that included British, French, and Belgian squadrons. The principles held because they were not dependent on any single individual. They were forged in the desert's fire, and they belonged to the regiment. Jock Lewis did not survive to see it. He was killed on December 30th, 1941, during the return from a raid when a lone Messerschmitt 110 strafed the LRDG truck carrying his patrol. A 20-millimeter cannon round struck him in the thigh, and he bled to death in approximately 4 minutes. He was 28 years old. His fiancée, Mirren Barford, had just sent a letter accepting his proposal of marriage. It never reached him. David Stirling would later say of Lewis, "Jock could far more genuinely claim to be the founder of the SAS than I." By the end of the Second World War, the SAS had suffered 330 casualties, but had killed or wounded 7,733 enemy combatants and captured 23,000. They had destroyed over 400 aircraft, severed rail lines, demolished supply depots, and operated behind enemy lines across North Africa, the Mediterranean, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. And every tactic, every instinct, every operational reflex that made those achievements possible, could be traced to the 18 months between November 1941 and January 1943, when a handful of men fought, adapted, and survived in the Libyan and Tunisian deserts. When the SAS was disbanded at the end of the war in October 1945, the War Office believed it had no peacetime role. They were wrong. Within 2 years, the regiment was reformed, initially as a territorial army unit, and within 5 years it was deployed to the jungles of Malaya to fight a communist insurgency. The desert veterans who formed the core of the reconstituted regiment brought with them every lesson the sand had taught: small team operations, self-sufficiency, navigational precision, intelligence-driven targeting, the ability to live and fight in terrain that would defeat conventional forces. These principles worked in the jungle as they had worked in the desert. And they worked in Oman in the 1970s, and at the Iranian embassy in 1980, and in the Falklands in 1982, and in the Gulf War in 1991, and in the alleyways of Baghdad and the mountains of Afghanistan in the years after 2001. The Americans would eventually arrive at many of the same conclusions. Delta Force, founded by Colonel Charlie Beckwith in 1977, was modeled explicitly on the SAS. Beckwith had served on an exchange tour with 22 SAS in the early 1960s and had recognized that the American military had nothing comparable. He spent over a decade fighting the Pentagon bureaucracy to create a unit built on British Special Operations principles. When Delta Force operators finally went to war alongside the SAS in Iraq, they discovered that their British counterparts were still operating with fewer resources, less technology, and smaller teams, and still achieving results that defied every metric the American military used to measure effectiveness. The British knew something the Americans didn't, or rather, they had learned it first, in the only classroom where such lessons can truly be absorbed: the field. The desert had been that classroom. It taught them that technology could fail, but skills would not; that numbers could be a disadvantage, but training never was; that the environment was not an enemy to be defeated, but a tool to be used; that the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield was not a bomb, a gun, or a vehicle, but a single human being who had been selected, trained, and hardened until he needed nothing but his own mind and his own body to accomplish what machines could not. 2 years in the desert made the SAS unbeatable, not because the desert made them invincible. Men died there. Good men, brilliant men. Jock Lewis died there. Dozens of others followed. The desert did not grant immortality. What it granted was something far more valuable. It granted clarity. It stripped away every piece of unnecessary weight, every false assumption, every institutional comfort, and left behind only what worked. Small teams, relentless training, radical adaptation, economy of force, the primacy of the individual. That is what the British knew. That is what 2 years of desert war burned into the DNA of the Special Air Service. And that is why, when they walked through the doors of compounds in Baghdad 60 years later with a speed and precision that left the most powerful military on earth speechless, the Americans asked the same question that the brigadier in Cairo had asked in 1942. How is that even possible? The answer was always the same. It was written in the sand of the Western Desert in 1941 by a man on crutches who broke into a headquarters with an idea, and by the men who followed him into the darkness with nothing but a compass, a haversack of homemade bombs, and the willingness to learn from every single thing the desert had to teach them. The desert taught them everything, and they never forgot a word of it. That is the story the desert told. That is the knowledge the British carried out of North Africa in 1943. And that is why, 80 years later, the Special Air Service remains what David Stirling, Jock Lewis, and Paddy Mayne built it to be: a regiment forged in sand and fire, tested against the worst that nature and the enemy could inflict, and proven unbreakable by both.